Rights are not gifts from government. They don't come from a constitution or a Bill of Rights or any document at all. Your natural rights come from your Creator, and you have them from the nature of your humanity. Even civil rights, they're also built on a foundation of natural rights. These were widely held views from the founders and the old revolutionaries. And on this episode, we're going to kick it off with the Declaration of Independence, do a bit of a dive into their view on natural rights, and also, I think even more importantly, highlight some of the people that they said we should be reading in case we want to learn more. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Friday, December 6th, 2024. And let's start out here with something we should all at least be somewhat familiar with, the Declaration of Independence, July 4, 1776. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these is not an exhaustive list, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And about a month earlier, you'll see some very similar text in George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights, June 12, 1776. Section 1, that all men are by nature equally free and independent, and have certain inherent rights, of which when they enter into a state of society, they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity, namely, the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. Thomas Paine wrote a ton about natural rights, and here's one of his great quotes. It is a perversion of terms to say that a charter gives rights. A charter may declare rights, they may affirm them, but they don't come from a charter. He continued, it operates by a contrary effect, that of taking rights away. Rights, he said, are inherently in all the inhabitants, but charters, by annulling those rights in the majority, leave the right by exclusion in the hands of a few. And John Dickinson, the penman of the American Revolution, he said charters were declarations, but not gifts of liberties. Rights, liberties, they are not gifts from government, and they don't come from documents. And here he is writing about the Stamp Act and some related issues in 1766. He said, kings or parliaments could not give the rights essential to happiness. If you watched or listened to my episode from a couple of days ago on Dickinson's highly influential Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania in 1767, he had a very similar take where he said rights are essential to happiness. He said we cannot be happy without being free. For Dickinson, our liberty, our rights are inherent, but they're also the source of everything else. And here he's talking about the source of the rights themselves. He said we claim them from a higher source, from the King of Kings and the Lord of all the earth. They are not annexed to us by parchments and seals. They are created in us by the decrees of providence, which establish the laws of our nature. They are born with us. We have them by our birth. They are born with us, exist with us, and cannot be taken from us by any human power without taking our lives. Now, as Thomas Jefferson pointed out, this view that he was discussing, these certain unalienable rights, in the Declaration of Independence, this wasn't made up by Jefferson or the committee that he worked together with on this. These weren't new views. He said that this was basically him trying to express the general American view of things. And this is how he put it in a letter to Henry Lee all the way in 1825. The object of the Declaration of Independence, he says, was not to find out new principles or new arguments never before thought of, not merely to say things which had never been said before, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject. He said it was intended to be an expression of the American mind, and to give to that expression the proper tone and spirit called for by the occasion. And then he gives us a bunch of people that we should, well, not a bunch, but some people that we should understand and read if we want to understand the American mind, which he expressed in the Declaration of Independence. He said all its authority rests then on the harmonizing sentiments of the day, whether expressed in conversations and letters, printed essays, or in the elementary books of public right, as Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, Sidney, etc. And Alexander Hamilton, he was actually an incredible writer during the Revolution. Here he is in 1775 in a public debate about, well, things like natural rights with a guy named Samuel Seabury. And here's how he put it. I shall henceforth begin to make some allowance for that enmity you have discovered to the natural rights of mankind. And he was good. For though ignorance of them in this enlightened age cannot be admitted as a sufficient excuse for you, yet it ought in some measure to extenuate your guilt. Just a quick aside, if 1775, Alexander Hamilton is pointing out the natural rights of mankind, ignorance of them, there's no excuse for that. What would he think of the people today? I know he was the big government guy of the ratification debates, but man, if even Hamilton was far better on our natural rights than virtually everyone alive today, it tells you how far off the rails things have gone. Anyways, he continued, if you will follow my advice, there still may be hopes of your reformation. I love his sarcasm. Apply yourself without delay to the study of the law of nature. So we now, first of all, have Jefferson's list of people to read if we want to understand natural rights and the expression of the American mind. Aristotle, Cicero, of course, John Locke. I'm not really going to cover Locke here today because you can find all kinds of content on him, and Sidney, who I'll get to in just a moment. But Hamilton includes another list I would recommend to your perusal. Grotius, that's Hugo Grotius. Puffendorf, Samuel Puffendorf. Locke again. Montesquieu and Burlamaqui. Jean-Jacques Burlamaqui is probably the guy, at least I think so, that really was the one who influenced them to use the phrase pursuit of happiness. I covered that in another episode. I don't have that one off the top of my head, but maybe I'll be able to remember to ask Alan to include that in the show links section. Anyways, so Grotius, Puffendorf, Locke, Montesquieu, and Burlamaqui. He said, I might mention other excellent writers on this subject, but if you attend diligently to these, you will not require any others. Man, Hamilton was good back then. Here's Jefferson as president in a conversation back and forth with a guy named Mason Locke Weems, who had asked him his opinion about that guy Sidney that he had mentioned. He said, you ask my opinion on the subject of publishing the works of Algernon Sidney. The world, wrote Jefferson, has so long and so generally sounded the praises of his Discourses on Government. That was a book that he wrote, the only one that I'm aware of that he wrote, published posthumously after his death. Jefferson said it seems superfluous and even presumptuous for an individual to add his feeble breath to the gale. So Jefferson's like, man, Sidney, it just speaks for himself. Even though he was president, author of the Declaration of Independence, one of the most famous Americans in the world, Jefferson's like, you don't need me for this. He said Sidney's work is probably the best elementary book of the principles of government as founded in natural right, which has ever been published in any language. If that is not a 5-star review, Algernon Sidney, it's not super easy reading. He wrote it in 1680 or so. It was published finally in 1698. He was actually killed for writing that book, but not publishing it. They found it in his home. And of course, it was talking about natural rights and rejecting the divine right of kings and the power of, well, the empire at the time. And so they killed him for it. He was seen as a hero to the principles of the American Revolution, a martyr for liberty by the old revolutionaries. Jefferson considered it the best elementary book on government founded in natural right. I covered that in an episode a few years ago, Jefferson's favorite book on government. I encourage you to check that one out as well, especially since tomorrow in history, December 7th, 1683, I think it was the year, was the day that he was put to death for, well, Sidney was put to death for writing that book. Anyways, back to it here. We're talking about unalienable rights, but there's also alienable rights. And I think the first person to actually make this distinction, there may have been earlier ones, but the first one that I'm aware of between alienable and unalienable was a guy from the Scottish Enlightenment thought named Francis Hutcheson. In his book, 1725-ish, An Inquiry into the Original of Our Ideas of Beauty and Virtue. Interesting name. But he put it this way: in the search of nature, there is the like beauty in the knowledge of some great principles or universal forces. Many people in the Enlightenment thought, the Dickinsons and Jeffersons of the time, they looked for inspiration and ideas and how to make sense out of things by looking to the natural world as well. And Newton was incredibly important. We're always taught that, well, Sir Isaac Newton, okay, just science, but it had a lot of crossover because of the way that those principles were viewed. And this is what Hutcheson is saying as well. Anyways, in the search of nature, there is the like beauty in the knowledge of some great principles or universal forces from which innumerable effects do flow, such as gravitation in Sir Isaac Newton's scheme. Such also is the knowledge of the original of rights, perfect and imperfect and external, alienable and unalienable. So Hutcheson in 1725-ish is writing about looking to Sir Isaac Newton's scientific views and making sense of our rights as being universal forces. And Thomas Jefferson, here's another episode you should check out, Jefferson's Trinity. Because in a letter to Benjamin Rush, Jefferson said that his trinity of the three greatest men the world had ever produced included Sir Francis Bacon. You could never have too much bacon. Plus Newton and Locke. I think that's an interesting one to include as well. But anyways, back to Hutcheson. He said the rights called perfect are of such necessity to the public good that the universal violation of them would make human life intolerable. And it actually makes those miserable whose rights are thus violated. Hamilton described it like this. He said, this is what is called the law of nature, the same 1775 paper. And here he is citing Blackstone, the law of nature, which being coequal with mankind and dictated by God himself is, of course, superior in obligation to any other. It is binding over all the globe, in all countries, and at all times. No human laws are of any validity if contrary to this. Man, we lost a good one when Hamilton switched to whatever big government guy he switched to during the ratification time. Because here he is in 1775, much younger, but a great thinker, an excellent writer, powerful writer. He's citing Blackstone and pointing out that no human laws anywhere on the globe are valid if they violate the laws of nature. He said, and such of them as are valid derive all their authority immediately or immediately from this original. Of course, it comes from Blackstone, but this is the point that he's making. He said, and this is back to Hamilton, upon this law depend the natural rights of mankind. The Supreme Being gave existence to man, together with the means of preserving and beatifying that existence. He endowed them with rational faculties, by the help of which to discern and pursue such things as were consistent with his duty and interest, and invested him with an inviolable right to personal liberty and personal safety. Man, that is a powerful, powerful paragraph right there. Now, of course, there's a distinction between natural and civil rights, alienable and unalienable, or vice versa. And Thomas Paine put it like this. Natural rights are those which appertain to man in right of his existence. Of this kind are all the intellectual rights, our right of thought, our viewpoints, our opinions, or rights of the mind, he said. And also all those rights of acting as an individual for his own comfort and happiness, which are not injurious to the natural rights of others. That might sound familiar to some of you, those of you who are in the more libertarian circles out there, something called the non-aggression principle. You can do whatever you want to do as long as you're not violating the rights of others. I guess that's my take on it. I'm probably not that great in citing it, but this is kind of a really early, if you're thinking about it, back in 1791, this is a really early precursor to that NAP, the non-aggression principle. You can, of this are the intellectual rights and all those rights of acting as an individual, which are not injurious to the natural rights of others. And Hutcheson gave some examples of these unalienable rights. The right of private judgment or of our inward sentiments is unalienable, since we cannot command ourselves to think what either we ourselves or any other person pleases. So also, he wrote, so are also our internal affections, which necessarily arise according to our opinions of their objects. Samuel Adams, in one of his best papers, The Rights of the Colonists, in November of 1772, again, put it like this. Among the natural rights of the colonists, very similar to what we saw a few years later in the Declaration of Independence, among them, this is not an exhaustive list, there are many others, but among the natural rights of the colonists are these. First, a right to life. Secondly, to liberty. Thirdly, to property, together with the right to support and defend them in the best manner they can. Adams continued. He said, these are evident branches of, rather than deductions from, the duty of self-preservation, commonly called the first law of nature. TLDR. You don't have intellectual rights. You don't have rights of the mind or property rights or anything else like the right to life unless you also have a right to defend them from being taken from you. I covered this in much more detail in another episode that I think is pretty awesome. You should check out. Second Amendment, everyone armed to preserve liberty. That will be included in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Again, we have all of our rights as the nature of our birth, and everyone on earth is born with these rights. And Paine put it like this: all men are born equal and with equal natural rights, in the same manner as if posterity had been continued by creation instead of generation, the latter being the only mode by which the former is carried forward. And consequently, he said, every child born into the world must be considered as deriving its existence from God. He said the world is as new to him as it was to the first man that existed, and his natural right in it is of the same kind. Now, of course, some people absolutely love government power. In fact, a lot of them want us to believe that this natural rights view from the founders and the old revolutionaries, well, it was only about maybe middle-aged white men, for example. But this is just a lie. Here, for example, James Otis Jr., in the Rights of the British Colonies Asserted and Improved 1764, before the Stamp Act, he said the colonists are by the law of nature free-born, as indeed all men are, white or black. And John Jay, the first Chief Justice, in 1792, he said, as to my sentiments and conduct relative to the abolition of slavery, the fact is this: in my opinion, every man of every color and description has a natural right to freedom. Or back to Thomas Paine in Rights of Man, Part 1. This is, I think, pretty interesting as well. The Mosaic account of the creation, whether taken as divine authority or merely historical, is full to this point: the unity or equality of man. So everyone has these natural rights. They're all born equal. The expression admits of no controversy. And then I think this is citing Genesis. I'm not really an expert on this. He said, and God said, let us make man in our own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. Paine continued, the distinction of sexes is pointed out, but no other distinction is even implied. Anyways, that was just a quick aside. I thought that was interesting stuff to include. Luther Martin, for example, and many others also discussed this kind of thing in the debates over the Constitution. Here from the Philadelphia Convention, he said the first principle of government, he said, is founded on the natural right of individuals, all individuals. And the first principle of government, if you're doing it the right way, is founded on that. And he said, and in perfect equality. And then he cites a few people that maybe we should read. Maybe I mentioned a few. Locke, Vattel, and then two people that most people haven't heard of, Lord Somers, Somers, and Dr. Priestley. He said they all confirm this principle. So if you're writing down or keeping track of some people to write, there's another 4 for you as well, maybe 3 additional ones. And Theophilus Parsons also discussed natural rights under the Constitution in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention. He said no power was given to Congress to infringe on any one of the natural rights of the people, none whatsoever. He said, should they attempt to do that without constitutional authority, the act would be a nullity. In other words, it would be void. Now, of course, it's up to the people to treat it that way as well, and that's another episode. Now, moving on to civil rights, Thomas Paine, in a letter to Thomas Jefferson, they had a lot of back and forth on this type of a topic. He explained it like this: civil rights, or rights of compact, are distinguishable from natural rights, because in the one we act wholly in our own person. In the other, we agree not to do so, but act under the guarantee of society. James Madison, in his speech where he was presenting his proposals for amendments to the Constitution, this is in the summer of 1780, well, was it summer? Yeah, June 8th, 1789. He said, "In some instances, they assert those rights which are exercised by the people in forming and establishing a plan of government. In other instances, they specify those rights which are retained when particular powers are given up to be exercised by the legislature." Talking about the 10th Amendment there, or a precursor to it. He said, in other instances, they specify positive rights, which may seem to result from the nature of the compact. And he gives an example here. Trial by jury, Madison said, cannot be considered as a natural right, but as a right resulting from the social compact which regulates the action of the community, but is as essential to secure the liberty of the people as any one of the pre-existent rights of nature. And Thomas Paine connected the dots like this. This is in his dissertation on the first principles of government. Will also be linked to in the show notes. He says, an inquiry into the origin of rights will demonstrate to us that rights are not gifts from one man to another, nor from one class of men to another. For who is he who could be the first giver? Or by what principle or on what authority could he possess the right of giving? They are not gifts, period. Paine said a declaration of rights is not a creation of them, nor a donation of them. It is a manifest of the principle by which they exist, followed by a detail of what the rights are. He said, for every civil right has a natural right for its foundation, and it includes the principle of a reciprocal guarantee of those rights from man to man. As therefore, it is impossible to discover any origin of rights otherwise than in the origin of man. You are born with them. They are from your creator. Thomas Jefferson, I think, really summed it up best. Here in his summary view of the rights of British America, 1774, he said, a free people claim their rights as derived from the laws of nature and not as a gift of their chief magistrate. As I go through these views, whenever I read through any of this stuff, I think it's pretty obvious why the government-run schools don't teach us these essential takes on natural rights. Well, because, the government-run schools are part of the system that has given us the largest government in the history of the world. But TAC, I think we're doing a pretty good job of having you covered, and nothing helps us reach and teach more and more people about natural rights and about so much more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you like the work that we're doing, you want to help us get this message out to more people, join us as a member today. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options available, or you can make a one-time donation over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. I'd be extremely grateful to any consideration for any consideration you can give to joining us as a member today. Again, from just $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I also want to give a huge thank you and a small, quick shout out to a handful of people who have joined us as members recently. There's Toby in Massachusetts, Anastasia in Kentucky, John in Illinois, Lowell in Utah, Diane in Texas, Jack in Alabama, Lawrence in Idaho, and Nancy in New Jersey. I'm extremely grateful for your support, whether it's a couple of bucks or a couple of hundred or anything in between. Thank you so much. And there's a few free, easy peasy ways you can help us spread the word. Hitting the like button, subscribing, getting notification, leaving reviews on Apple Podcasts, any other podcast platforms, comments, sharing links, all that stuff can help trigger algorithms, especially of the mainstream platforms, and tell them to show us to more people. We're reaching more people than I ever thought possible. When I started the 10th Amendment Center so many years ago as a one-person blog with the idea of reaching a single person, and then when I reached 5, then I'm like, we could maybe do more and keep growing, but it's only thanks to your help. So I really appreciate you being here. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it made you think. I hope you learned something. I hope you've got a nice long list of people that you're supposed to be reading and learning from, as based on what we heard from people like Jefferson, Hamilton, and others. And I hope you have an awesome weekend and look forward to seeing you next week here on the Path to Liberty.